African leaders are working to create what some people are calling a borderless Africa by introducing a single African passport, allowing free movement between all countries on the continent. The African Union, which represents 54 states, wants to abolish the need for Africans to get visas to visit African countries by 2018. And by next year, the AU wants to establish a free trade area across the continent. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Angelo Coppola, who joins us from Johannesburg. And Angelo, let's start with the AU passport and the concept of a borderless Africa. What's been the reaction in South Africa? And that's a country where, people haven't thrown out the welcome mat to foreigners trying to get into the country. There have been a spate of xenophobic attacks in the past few years.
Well, the reaction has been fairly muted. While President Zuma was at the latest AU summit, there hasn't been any official word yet on the South African position. It's also been fairly quiet from the Minister of Home Affairs, that's Malusi Gigaba. His department, you remember, was responsible for the new visa requirements into South Africa that had such a devastating impact on tourist numbers into the country last year. Those regulations, of course, have since been loosened or relaxed a bit, but there's still some after effects there. The South African authorities wanted biometric validation, in-person application for anyone wanting to come to South Africa to get those visas, something that the AU is also requesting with their new passports. There are analysts, though, who question the need for a continental passport when all that would really be required to make travel for Africans in Africa visa-free was to abolish visas altogether, and they could then use their validated passports that they're currently holding. Anna?
So now, how would a passport like this work? Would it be recognized by the rest of the world, for example?
Well, we're a bit thin on the detail at the moment, other than the marketing event that took place a couple of weeks ago at the AU summit, where those ceremonial passports were handed over to several high-level AU leaders. We don't really know that much. There's likely to be some reticence, though. I'm thinking here about South Africa, of course, given the country's reluctance to open its borders. It's also unlikely that the passports would be recognized by the rest of the world anytime soon. In his statement at the end of the summit, the South African president only mentioned these e-passports right near the end of his speech. And even then, he didn't give any clear indication that the South Africans were going to support the initiative. A milestone has been put in place, as you said, and this would be the first clue that this process is on track. And that's the publication of that implementation roadmap, which is due to see the light of day in around 2018. Then, of course, it's 2020, and this is the date that's been penciled in as the deadline for all Africans to have a continental passport. That's just 4 years away from today, Anand.
Now, Angelo, you mentioned expanding tourism, but what other advantages does an African passport bring to Africa and Africans?
Well, according to the AU here, they're saying that the passport should lead to the free flow of continental citizens that should stimulate economic growth. It should also see the free movement of skilled people, something that countries like South Africa have struggled with in the past for a range of unrelated issues. At the moment, though, there are very few countries on the continent that have relaxed their visa regulations, and there are probably 4 of them. There's Ghana, Seychelles, Rwanda, and Mauritius, and they've seen the benefit of having either relaxed or removed their visas altogether. If it does get the required traction, it's going to be a catalyst to broad-ranging continental economic growth, but it requires in-country acceptance first. So governments and citizens in these 54 countries on the continent have to sign off on the plan. Something that could prove to be a bit of a stumbling block. Anand?
All right, thanks, Angelo. That's CCTV's Angelo Coppola reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Nairobi is Wanyama Masinde. He's the director at the Center for Regional Integration. Also with us from Nairobi is David Stanton. He's the Director General of Trademark East Africa, a trade organization aimed at growing prosperity in East Africa. From Johannesburg, we're joined by Adetunji Omotola. He's the founder of the Guild of Nigerian Professionals in South Africa. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Edward Brown. He's the Director of Policy Advisory Services at the Africa Center for Economic Transformation based in Ghana. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Wanyama, let me start with you in Nairobi. Why an African passport and borderless travel? What does that do for Africa and for Africans?
Yes, it's high time that Africans were able to move freely, because this is something that they've done from before colonial times. If you look at the Abuja Treaty of 1991, Article 43 of the Abuja Treaty, it calls for free movement of Africans, but up to date that is not happening. It's happening just in small pockets of the continent, but movement across the continent is impossible. And yet this is a right for Africans, because if you look at Article 12 of the African Charter for Human and People's Rights, it says that every individual on the continent has a right to leave his country and to return. And these rights are not being enjoyed yet, and the African Union is there to bring prosperity for the people of the continent. And if you look at the continent, we have a number of free trade areas where we are allowing people to move their capital, to move their investment, but we are not allowing those people to follow the investments, and it's high time that this happened. And that's why the African Union at the 50th anniversary celebrations in 2013 called for free movement of people on the continent. And if you look at Agenda 2063 of the continent, therein is a call that among the priorities that Agenda 2063 should deliver is free movement of people on the continent. We want people to do business. We want people to bring prosperity. For them to do business, we need to allow them to move.
Okay, let's talk about prosperity. David, as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the program, one of the reasons behind the idea of a borderless Africa is that it would boost economic growth on the continent. Make that connection for us. How does the movement or the free movement of people boost economic growth?
Well, at the moment, Africa has about 14% of the world's population, but only 3% of the economic growth. So there's an imbalance there, and one of the reasons for that is that it's quite difficult to trade across borders on the continent, and that requires better infrastructure and better trade systems. Now, if the better infrastructure and trade systems were introduced, the percentage of trade that is represented by exports within African countries would increase, and that almost always helps to generate incomes and growth in any economy. So I would agree that it's very important to increase the volume of trade by trading across borders, and of course goods, services and people must be allowed to freely cross borders in order for that growth to take place.
Adetunji, this is an ambitious idea, an ambitious plan proposed by the African Union, but do you think that the continent is ready for a common passport and borderless travel? I mean, we just have to look at South Africa, where you are right now. There's been widespread xenophobic attacks against foreigners in South Africa. There's a perception there that foreigners are taking away local jobs. So are we ready for this?
Well, look, it's, in my view, very ambitious, but in pockets of it, we have to receive it with a lot of excitement. I know, for example, in January this year, there was a maiden flight from Johannesburg to Abuja. South African Airways was actually on that flight. We're very excited. We've been waiting for Nigeria to open up beyond Lagos and Johannesburg. So people in the northern part of Nigeria, they can easily travel into Johannesburg and they can go about their business and go further into South Africa. So I believe it's exciting, but there are many challenges. Of course, we know that Africa tends to be compartmentalized in terms of regions. You have SADC, you have COMESA, you have ECOWAS, and you also have the East African Community. And of course, there are language barriers. For example, West Africa, where I come from, Nigeria is surrounded by 4 countries, and none of them speak English. So if you recall a few years ago, when President Jonathan wanted to have a conversation with Nigeria's neighbors, they had to go and see Francois Hollande in Paris. So there are many challenges. Of course, even if you look at the issue of currencies, if you wanted to do business in South Africa and you're coming in from Nigeria, you'll have to change from the naira to the dollar, and then come to Johannesburg and change the dollar to the rand. So there's no direct exchange of currencies even between the major economies. And the same is true when you go to Ghana. You've got to change your money to the Ghanaian cedi. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of language barriers, in terms of currencies, in terms of also the volatility that exist currently in some of the major countries in Africa, given the fact that the commodity prices have tapered off, particularly in Angola and Nigeria and many other oil-producing countries. So even though we're excited about the AU passport, we know that only about 13 countries in Africa have gone biometric in terms of their passports. There's only about 13 countries that do visa on arrival, Ghana being one of them that has joined the club lately. So there are many challenges, and I think it's still going to take a long time to be able to see people moving freely. And of course, the poorer countries tend to rely on the money they generate from visas in the same way that they rely on higher tariffs that they generate from people importing into their countries.
Edward, we look at how economic growth could get a boost with the free movement of people, but let's look at another aspect of that idea, and that is, how do current visa restrictions in Africa hurt the continent economically?
I think the evidence is incontrovertible that the current visa restrictions hurt economic development and transformation in Africa. I give you an example. The rapid increase in irregular migration is by nature the outcome of restrictions that are imposed by countries, because migrants would
When you say irregular, you mean people crossing borders illegally?
People crossing borders without documentation.
Right.
And in fact, the evidence, if you look at the analysis, on the contrary, if you want to control movement, you have to open your borders, because then you can document those who are coming in. And if you document those who are coming in, you have good internal processes of identifying those that are high risk, then you're better off than people who come in whom you don't even know they are there. You know, and if you want to strengthen, one of the key things that we need to do as we open our borders is also to strengthen the institutions that can ensure proper control of labor movements, that can increase the access of labor where the needs are. There is tremendous mismatch between skills across the regions. Right. We have 15 or 18 countries that are landlocked, whose development is contingent on their relationship with the other countries. And with closed borders, you are stifling economic growth. You can't even begin to establish industries that have the capability to expand and produce competitive products, not only for the international market, but for the regional countries in the region. And one of the things that irregular and undocumented migration does is to depress wages in the countries where they go. Because they're not documented, employers take advantage of them, right, and therefore depress wages. On the contrary, if these are documented, then the labor laws would be much more effective in administering and ensuring that people get jobs.
Okay, Wanyama, there was an article in the online business magazine Quartz Africa which said that, and this is the magazine writing, it said that it's appalling that it's easier for Europeans and Americans to travel in Africa than it is for Africans themselves. Why is it so difficult for Africans to travel within the continent?
That is the predicament that we face, that we find it difficult to allow our own people to travel across the continent, and yet we allow people from elsewhere to do that. And this is exhibited, if you look at, in the figures that we have, if you look at intra-African trade, just above 10%, which is a huge difference from what happens elsewhere. Yes, there's been concern looking at the continent because of poverty levels and the mistrust of one another. And in fact, as we move towards free movement of persons, we need to look at the confidence building amongst ourselves. Because look at the continent, 54 states, 54 borders, 54 barriers to doing business. Something is happening. If you look at the Africa Development Bank's Visa Openness Index 2016, you'll see that 20% of African states allow visa-free access to them. 25% visas on arrival, and the other 55, there's a big challenge there. You, as an African, you cannot go there. The fear that people will come to take our jobs because they are poor like us, because the belief then is that that are from outside Africa are well off, they have the resources, they will not come to take our jobs, they'll come to invest. But look at the continent, there's a lot of investment, intra-African investment. There are Africans investing across borders now. There are states where the bulk of the investments are from across the borders. Africa is changing. It's changing quite a lot, and we need to change with the continent ourselves.
Okay.
We need to open the borders to one another. And if you look at Rwanda, which has opened up, it does not mean that when you open up, you'll be inundated with people from the neighboring countries or elsewhere. It does not happen. People move for a reason.
Right. David, the idea of an African Union passport, will that unify the continent? I mean, couldn't AU member states simply just lift all visa restrictions?
Well, I think the Africa Union proposal is progressive, and as we've heard from other speakers, it is ambitious and a lot of work needs to be done. But the principle of opening up the economies of the continent is critical. And of course, the free movement of goods and services and people is critical. So those obstacles have to be met and overcome. And in East Africa, in the East Africa community, which is a relatively coherent regional economic grouping of only 6 countries, then a lot of progress has actually been made to harmonize standards for services and to, for example, to make the tourism industry more regional and less country-based, allowing foreign direct investment and companies to operate on a regional rather than a national level, and for qualified people and companies to work across the borders. But I do share the concerns of some of the speakers at the scale and the time, the scale of the challenges and the time it will take. But I do think that there are essential measures, and that a free trading across borders and more open migration is essential to make that leap forward. Having said that, we're aware that there are challenges to regional integration in other parts of the world, not least in Europe. So there has to be counterbalancing measures which restrict unlimited flows of migration, so that the burden on countries is not excessive. And after all, the level of underemployment and unemployment in all African countries is unacceptably high. So there has to be well-balanced and carefully managed migration and carefully managed harmonization of the conditions of trade, so that markets are opened up, common markets are made bigger for foreign direct investors in a way that will encourage a greater proportion of that investment in the African continent.